Welcome everybody to this event. I have the honor to moderate this discussion. Excuse me, I will just start again. Welcome everybody to this event, which is organized by the City of Warsaw and Kultura Liberalna. My name is Karolina Figura, and I will have the honor to moderate the discussion today. And I do believe this will be a very interesting and fascinating discussion, not only because it has been organized because of the 30th anniversary of Polish local government, but also because we are dealing with a very special moment today. As you well know, our world has changed profoundly in the past few weeks due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And when we have been organized this debate, we have been thinking that we should focus on the existing institutions and initiatives and look into the potential that they have in the fight against the virus. And our stress, our thought was also on the cities, because not only the mayor of cities, of European cities, are an ever more important part of European Union and Europe as such today, but also because cities are one of the most important, most local levels on which the fight against virus is taking place. So we have this very important context, and we also have a very important other context, namely, in ancient times, cities already began to be the heart of democracy. So there is this question which is also connected with the pandemic. How does the pandemic of COVID-19 virus is affecting our democracy, and how it is affecting the freedoms of the citizens, of the city inhabitants? So I will present you now the guests that we have today. We have 5 distinguished guests. First, there is our host, President Rafał Trzaskowski, the Mayor of Warsaw. Hi, everybody. And then I will present alphabetically Zdeněk Hřib from Prague, the Mayor of Prague. Then we have Anna König Jerlmyr, the Mayor of Stockholm.
Hi, everyone.
We have Gergely Karácscony, the Mayor of Budapest. Hi, hello. And we have Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London. So here
it's great to see you looking healthy.
So here is how this is going to work today. I will first give the floor to Rafał Trzaskowski, who will have his short welcoming speech. And then I will simply ask questions and will try to make my best in this quite difficult online conditions to structure the debate from one subject to another. So, Mr. Trzaskowski, please do take the floor.
Hi, how you doing, everybody? I mean, it's a great pleasure to actually see you all healthy. That's good, because we were worried what's going on in different cities. My thoughts were with you, especially when the situation was difficult. My thoughts were with London. My thoughts were with Stockholm. My thoughts were with Budapest and Prague. And obviously, I think this is going to be a fascinating conversation because we took different approaches. We had, different kind of problems, and obviously the COVID, in our countries was of a different magnitude. So it's going to be quite interesting to talk about it and to actually see how you've dealt with it. Of course, it had, first of all, it, really spooked us because we were worried about our close ones, and we were worried about, the citizens of our cities, seeing what was happening in China, seeing what was happening in Italy and in Spain. I was in contact with the mayor of Milan and with the mayor of Madrid. We were really worried seeing what was happening there. And of course, some of the things that were happening in your cities actually made us tremble and made us think on how to actually deal with the pandemic. The thing was obviously how to take care, of our citizens, and that was the most important thing. I'm responsible for 10 hospitals in Warsaw. We're responsible for the housing seniors, and of course we had to react immediately. The problem was that at the beginning the cooperation with the central government was, let's say, quite positive, but then, as the pandemic was progressing it became more and more difficult. A lot of responsibility was shifted towards the local government. Sometimes we felt that we were left alone and we had to deal with our apprehensions and we had to deal with quite a lot of difficult situations. Obviously, the situation in Warsaw and in Poland was not as serious as it was, for example, in London and in the United Kingdom. But I think that COVID taught us one thing, that we, in this crazy world, which is, actually changed in our eyes and was put on its head, that suddenly we thought about the most important values and the most important questions that needed to be addressed. I mean, we thought about, of course, health. We thought about security. We thought about equal chances in education because, we had to continue virtual education for our kids. And I think that this focus on the most important needs of our citizens teaches us a lesson that this world is progressing and galloping somewhere into the future. But sometimes it's good to stand on your knees, on your legs, and look into the future and focus on the things which are really important. And I think there are quite a lot of lessons to be learned, and that's what I would want to actually focus our debate on, because it seems that, first of all, the pandemic will actually accelerate long-term trends affecting our cities, where we will focus on public transportation, on retail trade, on the transition to a non-contract economy, on the transition to remote work, virtual delivery of services, but also on micromobility that many of our cities were focusing on or have been focusing on for years, or things such as tactical urbanism, temporary improvements in public sphere, including creation and widening of sidewalks and bicycle paths, developing temporary routes for cyclists, all the things that we were doing in London and Budapest, in Stockholm and in Warsaw. But the most important thing is that actually it made us aware that there are certain values, civic rights that whatever happens need to be cherished. The questions of proximity that are the most important ones, the questions of responsibility of the local government for the citizens of our cities, regardless of how the central government reacts and how it treats us. And it puts everything in perspective. So I think that there's quite a lot of things to cover. And I would be most interested to hear your own experiences. I mean, London took, for example, and Great Britain took a completely different tack and a different had a different attitude towards COVID, and Stockholm a completely different one, and the Swedish government. So it would be really interesting to hear you out about your experiences, but most importantly, what lessons could be drawn from it. I will finish with one thing. When I was meeting with people responsible for city planning and for running the city, for the services, trams, metro, and so on and so forth, for public sanitation, with the bosses of all the companies that the city is responsible for. It took me like a week to meet them all, because it takes an hour and a half. You have to say hello, sit down, coffee, tea, and then you discuss things, how are your kids, and so on and so forth. Now, video conferencing, they're all on a video conference. It took me 2 hours, and I knew more than I knew after a week of long meetings, where sometimes, let's be honest, you just waste time. So there are also good things that we can learn from COVID, it seems, when it comes to managing the cities.
Yes, I think it's extremely important to not only to mention the negative sides of COVID, but also the positive sides of COVID, namely that we do not only stick to the fact that the quarantine itself, the restrictions are extremely difficult, but also search for sources of hope, basically. So I would like to take it from here and to ask a question about your own partly personal, but also partly professional account on how pandemic looked like in your cities. So basically, you combine a role of a private person, and at the same time, you are leaders of your cities. So you have this private and public experience of how the atmosphere looked like, how the solutions were looked for. So I would like perhaps to start with Stockholm, because Stockholm and Sweden as itself has been such an important point of reference in European discussions about the social isolation and quarantine in the past few weeks.
Thank you. Yes, I noticed there's a lot of international interest about the Stockholm or Swedish way. And of course, our national government put a lot of trust in the national authorities, health organizations, experts, and really early on they said that the strategy, I think, was to have this herd immunity, but now perhaps they understand that herd immunity is not a reality, and they said, oh, perhaps we should have done tougher measures in the beginning. But one strategy that I really support is that we put a lot of trust in our citizens, and we said you have a huge responsibility to keep social distance and basic hygiene, but also, of course, to keep the society quite open. So we didn't shut down elementary schools, but we did it with high schools for older kids. And that was one reason, because we saw in the segregated areas, these young people are the most who need education the most. That's why we thought it was a bad strategy to shut down the elementary schools, for example, or the nursery homes for children. So we have a situation now where the curve is bending, but of course it's 4,000 dead in a small country as Sweden. So of course that has we had a lot of international interest, of course, because sometimes one reflection that other media do is that our government really put their trust in the national authorities, but we need also political leadership. But I think one way was to just keep the society as open as possible, and also to put the trust in the citizen. And I think that so many Stockholmers really shown that they could, embrace this strategy and embrace the trust. So they really worked hard with social distances. And early on, also, we had a visitors ban when it comes to elderly homes, and they respected that as well, even though it was really difficult for many not to have the possibility to visit their elders and elderly and relatives. So here we are, and we have fewer cases day by day, but of course we didn't put Sweden in lockdown or quarantine, and of course that has awakened a lot of international interest, of course.
Thank you very much, Anna. And may I now turn to Sadiq Khan, the mayor of London, and ask about how it looked like in London. Because at the very beginning, the UK basically also seemed to go the way that was seemingly similar to the Swedish way. So the restrictions at the very beginning were not as strict as on the continent. And then slowly, the decision has been changed. So I would like to ask about your account on how the pandemic looks like in London.
Well, firstly, can I begin by saying it's lovely to see four good friends, leaders of four great cities. But I want to thank Rafał in particular, who's a dear friend. I know he loves his job, but his love of Poland means he's applying for another job. I wish him the best of luck in that job application. Can I just say, to listen to the mayor of Stockholm and the mayor of Warsaw, now I'm looking forward to hearing the mayors of Prague and Budapest. So one of my frustrations, and I'm sure the mayors of the other four great cities feel this, is we rely in a crisis on our national governments to show leadership. And you're absolutely right. We had some real concerns about some of the decisions made by our government early on during this global pandemic. And anybody who knows about crisis management knows there needs to be message clarity. And I'm afraid the UK government, in my view, made a lot of errors. And that is one of the reasons, in my view, why there have been a large number of deaths. To give you an idea of the scale, our population as a country is about 66 million. London's about 9 million. We've lost more than 39,000 people who've died in hospitals and care homes. There's probably many more who died at home. And in London, we've lost more than 6,000 people just in hospitals and care homes. And we suspect it's going to be much more when you include deaths at home. A lot of this was, you're absolutely right. We think because of community transmissions early on when the virus first reached our country, and the government's been playing catch up. What we failed to do was order enough testing material, order the right personal protective equipment, make sure we were having lockdown measures in place early doors. And it's a classic conundrum we have that Rafał was talking about lives versus livelihoods, wealth versus health. And I think they're linked. And that's why I think it's really important to learn the lessons. And just to be frank, I end by this. I think there will need to be a reckoning. In my country already, people are calling for an independent inquiry to learn the lessons from how we dealt with this crisis, because the bad news is it will not be the last global pandemic. I say this, cities have been the epicenters of pandemics in the past. Think of the Spanish flu, think of the Black Death, think of this. And so one of the reasons why I welcome Rafał organising this is we can learn from each other. And I'm really keen to hear from the mayors, not just Warsaw and Stockholm, but Prague and Budapest, to see what we did well, what we did less well, how we can work together to make sure we recover from this pandemic in a way where we don't return to business as usual, but we have a new normal so we can have a better future.
I think that this subject of tensions is extremely important. So you have various tensions here. In two of the panelists' interventions already was visible that there are some tensions between the cities and the national governments. So this is, I think, something that affects in a great way the way the COVID-19 is being fought against. But also we have other tensions that have been mentioned, mainly the tensions which are connected with emotions. So frustration, anger, sadness, fear of what is going to happen. And I do believe that those are very, very important elements of the pandemic, and also pandemic understood as something that is going on in a social entity, in a city. So I would like now ask to Zdeněk Hřib about Prague and whether it was also similar in your opinion. Did you see any similar tensions that were mentioned before by Anna or by Rafał or by Sadiq?
Yes, thank you, Carolina. Definitely, yes. The problem of in our city was definitely cooperation with the national government, because a lot of their orders or recommendations and so on were very, very chaotic. But I believe still we did found our way how to deal with this, and I'm very glad that all the Prague citizens respected all the measures that were put in place. And for example, we were the first city in Europe who ordered the mandatory face masks, although they were not available on the market. So I'm glad that all the citizens of Prague really went in a very, very good way with this. I have to say that we have seen even ministers of our government having an argument on the social networks. So this is a specific time where the mayors play a very important role, because it's up to them to take care of the people. And I'm glad to hear that all the mayors in Europe did their job very well. We did all the things that Rafał had already mentioned, like taking care of the people in elderly homes, or coordinating a network of volunteers, for example, and so on. So I think it just shows that the importance of this layer of democracy, of this layer of the city's self-governance, that it could, in the time of crisis, actually come handy, specifically when the national government is not doing that much good job.
Thank you very much, Zdeněk. And in this round, the last question goes to Gergely Karácscony. And this is again the same question about your personal account on the pandemic in the city of Budapest. What went right? What went wrong? Where were the biggest tensions?
Én is nagyon szépen köszönöm a lehetőséget.
I would also like to thank you for the opportunity to be able to talk in such illustrious circle. With this topic, I would like to thank especially my host, Rafał, for the invitation. I would also like to wish him all the best for the upcoming future. The key question is such an important question to me is collaboration, and in Hungary, the political elite actually did not get a pass in this exam, unlike the citizens who behaved in an exemplary way. What Zdeněk and the other mayors reported about were also valid for Budapest. And it is not that there was no collaboration between the local government and the central government, but there was a political war actually between us, which actually made collaboration a lot more difficult. Mm-hmm. This was important especially because the pandemic attacked the institutions in Budapest most of all. Most of all, it was hospitals. And through hospitals, it was elderly homes who actually carried out chronic disease take care. And political defense was more important to government, and they tried to hide data, so we still don't know how many people died of hospital infections, but one third of the infections came about in state hospitals. 1/3 of the patients were people contaminated who got into hospital because of another illness, so this data actually leaked out, although they tried to hide it.
Viszont a magyar polgárok és köztük a budapestiek,
the Budapest citizens and the Hungarian citizens
korlátozó intézkedéseket, hogy viseljenek a járvány idején, rendkívül fegyelmezettek voltak,
suffer a lot of restraining measures, were very disciplined, and we trusted their collaboration, so that is why we took all the important measures in spite of government measures like hospice measures and other limitations, and statistics show that in Budapest, the Budapest citizens complied with these measures in a high degree in terms of social distancing.
Több mint 90%-kal csökkentek a társadalmi kontaktusok a járvány elején, és statisztikáink szerint 98%-ban
according to our statistics, 98% of the people do use masks.
Ez reményel történik azzal kapcsolatosan, hogy a várossal lehet másféleképpen viszonyulni, lehet őszintén beszélni a problémákról, megosztani az információkat, és egy másfajta kormányzást, politikát hatékonyan képviselni. Ez azért is fontos, hogy Magyarországon a kormány járvány kapcsán számos
in terms of the pandemic took several measures that restricted, limited the freedom of citizens and the freedom of different policies, because it said that this was important in order to fight the pandemic. And we believe that in Budapest, honest communication, sincere communication makes it more efficient than any kind of power measure, so to say.
Thank you very much, Gergely. And now I would like to talk about the lessons from pandemic, lessons for European cities, but I would not like to do it as it is usually done. So tell us what was so great in your case and what would you like to share with the others. I would like each of you to name one thing that went wrong, and you would like to work on it in order to make the solutions in a probable future pandemic, and also in this pandemic, if this is going to intensify, for example, in the autumn. So one lesson that is something that went wrong, and one lesson that is something that went right, that you would like to share with the other European cities, and you would like to be proud of that it was such a good solution. Perhaps we'll start with Rafał Trzaskowski again.
Well, I mean, listening to you all, I think that there are quite a lot of things that went wrong, but I will tell you about the lessons that we draw from it as well. But the most important thing is, and Sadiq has actually named it right, is the question of messaging. And I would say that at the beginning of the pandemic in Poland, probably the government did the messaging right, because we were one of the countries where all the restrictions were put in place rather early with pretty good communication. And at the beginning, even the cooperation with the local government was okay. The problem was when the restrictions were actually then taken out, and the way in which it was done, it was completely haphazard, and there was no cooperation with the local government whatsoever. And then the government completely lost it when it comes to actually signaling. I mean, for example, at the beginning, the government was saying you don't need to wear masks. Suddenly, we all needed to wear masks. They were opening parks, they were closing parks to open them in 2 weeks. They were, for example, asking us, prepare yourselves to open up kindergartens and schools, but they were not telling us what was the pandemic situation in different regions of Poland, and they were shifting responsibility towards the local government. When we were asking, okay, you're the ones who have all the instruments to tell us what we should do and what the real danger is. You're the ones who should actually do more testing in order to secure jobs and lower the apprehension levels. And the government was not doing it. And it was shifting responsibility towards us also for political reasons. Unfortunately, the Polish government, the conservative government, wanted to organize elections on the 10th of May. And they were actually trying to prove that the situation is getting better, although, we were getting more and more people sick. And also the problem of cooperation with the local government. I mean, there was also almost no cooperation, and they were putting restrictions on us, for example, saying only 30% of people in public transportation. And they were, passing laws that we were supposed to implement in a matter of hours. And of course, all of that needs preparation. So the problem for the future, because we need to learn a lesson, because, the pandemic, knock on wood, might come back, is to actually increase this likelihood of a good cooperation between different levels of government, and actually clearly stating who's responsible for what. Now, when it comes to the biggest problem of mine, in my mind, of course, it's health and security. We all know it. But one lesson that can be learned from that is equal chances in education, because education will actually become more virtual. And in Poland and in Warsaw, 15% of all the kids disappeared from the radar screen because they didn't have access to virtual education. And that means that this is something we should work on regardless of what's going to happen with pandemics. And of course, our focus on job security, especially for the self-employed people. Because the thing that changed is, of course, we have quite a lot of divisions in all of our great cities, right? And we all know that. We know where are the pockets in our cities which need to be addressed, where there's lower income, when there are different possibilities and so on and so forth. But now the world changed completely. People who are quite affluent, but who are self-employed, artists, the whole creative sector, suddenly the same people who were rather affluent, almost in a week or two, became their jobs were not secure anymore, and there were quite a lot of apprehensions. And the world is changing, because this is not a trend that we will just observe in a week or two. I mean, some of those things will stay with us together, and those things need to be addressed. For example, talking about renting office space. I mean, one of the biggest companies, or all of the biggest companies, law firms in Warsaw now say, we are going to need just 50% of our office space, because lots of people will stay at home forever. And now how to address that? How it will actually impact the public transportation system, where of course there's lesser trust in public transportation systems. How many people will travel when a lot will stay home? What about education? What about preschools? How to organize that in order for those changes to be addressed? Low interest rates, for example, also create certain chances, for example, for energy transformation that we need to think about, because, and this is the last thing I want to address, because now we all know that the European Union and all of our national governments are actually focusing on growth of development, but we cannot lose from sight the questions of fighting climate change. We need to actually use this situation in order to create synergies. And finally, the problem with my government is that now they are actually leaving us aside. We are obviously, because Warsaw is dependent, as every Polish city and every Polish self-government, on taxes. We are having 50% of what we had before, and the government is trying to help everyone but the local governments. So they are planning huge investments, like a new biggest airport in the world, seriously, in the world, and not focusing, instead of focusing on our local investments, which can actually save the day.
So basically, lessons, what Rafał has said, communication or messaging, cooperation and cohesion, not only between the local government and the national government, but also social cohesion, I will say, and also education. Would you also think that those are the most important lessons? Of course, when I ask this question, I have before my eyes New York and the pictures and the films, footages from New York, where we see that the COVID-19 pandemic actually was also a catalyst of an even bigger polarization that we had before. So the question is, of course, about social cohesion, but also about those two other things, communication and education. Would you also see the most important lessons in the same spheres, or would you name the other ones? Perhaps I will now turn to Anna König Jerlmyr. We can't hear. Is everything fine?
Sorry, I didn't hear. Is it?
Yes, you can continue. Did you hear the question?
Yes, about when you talked about New York, yeah. And I also want to say just first that I think it's really crucial that we have this kind of discussion and that we can share experience, what worked and what didn't work. And I also want to thank Rafał for this initiative. And I'm a true supporter of your candidacy. And I wish you all the luck, because I think this is exactly the type of leaders that Europe will need in the future. But with that said, I would say that we had a situation like what you described, because really early on we could see that the most segregated areas in our city was the worst when it came to transmission and people affected by the virus. So there was a discussion about unemployment, segregation, but of course also it was a polarized debate. And then this needs to be discussed in the future. So we have to talk about how can we put measures on these areas when it comes to new jobs, better education, especially now when some schools were closed during the pandemic. And exactly what Rafał also said, that these children needs better education and more possibilities to digital education, of course. So we had that discussion, and also what worked and didn't work. We could see that early on we had a huge lack of equipment, medical equipment. That is also that you saw who is responsible. We still have that debate in the country. Is it on a regional level, on a local level, or is it on a national level? But of course, as we can see in other countries as Finland, we should have national supply of medical equipment. But of course also perhaps our own industry producing medical equipment. So that is one thing that is in the debate in Sweden and Stockholm, of course. And also tests, because now we have a huge debate in Stockholm and Sweden about who's responsible for the tests. And it's still not really working, so it's also something really discussed, and we can see that some cities were really early when it comes to tests. So that is also for the second wave or a new pandemic in the future. We need to have solutions on that. But one thing that worked was in the high schools and the digitalization. It worked really well. And it's an old saying that nothing happened for decades, and then decades can happen in weeks. And that's exactly what happened when it comes to our high school, and working together with companies as Microsoft and so on, just to have this fantastic possibilities in just a couple of weeks to have digital education that would have taken years in Stockholm otherwise, but it took actually weeks to, and then we will keep that, of course, in now, and also for the universities, that digital education really works.
So it seems it's education, 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 and of course medical supplies, and of course providing a well-prepared healthcare system. Sadiq Khan, do you also find the same spheres in which the most important lessons have been learned? You mentioned before the past pandemics and the fact that we perhaps should await another one, which is just behind the corner, like with the Black Death, for example, which lasted in Europe once. One episode lasted for almost 7 years. So we should probably get used to pandemics. When you think about that, what is the most important lesson that you learned from the COVID-19 pandemic so far? What went right and what went wrong? I do believe that we lost the connection. With Sadiq. Yes. So if everybody else is able to hear me right now, I can see that you all have the connection. So why don't we turn now to Zdeněk Hřib with the same questions about what went right, what went wrong? Are there the most important lessons, the lessons that include education, communication, social cohesion, medical equipment, and then we'll turn back to Said.
Well, of course, I have to confirm the problems regarding the medical equipment. This was a complete disaster because no one was actually prepared. And in fact, it turned out that, for example, there were people from China who were buying out the medical supplies also in our country and shipping it to China in the first month of this year. So the communication definitely was the key thing, and unfortunately it did not went very well, specifically in the very beginning. We had problems on the national level with the horizontal communication between the various ministries. They were, as I have said, arguing over the social networks. This was not a very good message. But we had also the problems regarding the vertical communication between us and the national government. But this was eventually cleared out, and it's much better now. However, I have to say that I see some sort of a tendency of the government to centralize the power, and they took this opportunity during the crisis to centralize more the power and basically keep the sort of so they pushed the city's government to a sort of lesser position. And this is definitely not very good. And for example, they are doing it either in a maybe very direct way, and I think I have seen something like that in Hungary. However, in our case, it's a more subtle way. And this is being done, for example, in a way that they take away the money for the cities. For example, in case of Czech Republic, it's €500 million they have taken from the cities and towns and villages and also regions to cover their expenses. And this money will, of course, we will miss this money for the investments. And this is definitely not a good thing, because we need the money to help the local economies and the regional economies to be fixed. And they have also done this in many other ways. For example, when they constructed the recovery fund, they somehow forgot to include Prague, or they have used the tool that it was not possible to include Prague in this recovery fund. So I see as one of the major risks in this area actually the tendencies of the national government to centralize their power in a sometimes not very democratic way.
Yeah. Same question to Gergely Karácscony about the lessons that you have learned, most important lessons about things that went wrong, but also what you would like to share with the other mayors in order to prepare ourselves better for the future pandemics.
Well, when I'm talking to Rafał and Zdeněk, then I'm always very shocked to see how similar our situation is as opposition municipal leaders in regions where we see that a lot of advancement that we made in the last 30 years is now being turned back. Now, the same happened here. So when in Prague, the mayor made it compulsory to wear masks, then the Hungarian government was explicitly against wearing masks. Now, we made it compulsory as a city, and then a couple of weeks later, the government also agreed that, yes, this is a good thing, and they made it compulsory in the whole country. When we saw the international lessons learned that you need to test, especially in institutions and especially in shelters and in elderly homes, then the government said, no, this is just, this is not necessary, you don't have to test because this just gives you the notion of security when it's not working. And then the city of Budapest started its own testing, and then a couple of weeks later the government also said that, yes, one of the most efficient things is to test. And while we were also about trying to get medical equipment and tests and trying to make measures to save the city, and there were a lot of extra costs and expenditures of the city, because, for example, due to despite that there was a 90% drop of ticket revenues of mass transportation, the government still kept taking away funding from Budapest, and this is what they're planning to do in the future. And they're also levying extra tasks on the city. So not only that they are taking away funding from the city, they are levying extra tasks on Budapest. So Budapest will have to pay more into the central budget than, for example, the banking sector in the country, through these special taxes. So you have the feeling that the government uses one hand to fight against the pandemic and uses the other hand to fight against the local governments, the municipalities. And this is not only against the efficiency of the defense against the pandemic, but also this acts against the recovery because they are punishing the local communities, and in this way it's difficult to recover. Let me tell you something else which I've been thinking of. Again, I could talk about the community. So Budapest, the small and medium-sized small enterprises and the businesses, they adapted very, very quickly. There are a lot of businesses that rechanneled their services. Budapest, the citizens of Budapest actually adapted to the new transportation methods, and also we managed to develop bicycle paths and bicycle lanes, and we managed to fight down the backlog that we had in part.
So also lessons in public transportations. I think this is a very, very important sphere. And I would like now to go back to Sadiq Khan, because we lost a connection for a couple of seconds and we couldn't hear you. Sadiq, my question was about the lessons. What went right and what went wrong? And can you please share your most important lessons as for those things where you learned something? Because, for example, people were unprepared for what happened, and then something that you would be particularly proud of and you would like to share it with the other European cities?
Well, Carolina, I mean, Rafał talked about one of the advantages, one of the lessons and the benefits of the virus, which is we can have video conferences. And one of the advantages is when you're asked a tough question, you can pretend you've been disconnected. And that's not what I do. But it's Rafał knows what I'm talking about. So does Anna. And look, I think a number of things here. Firstly, a genuine observation for those watching this. There are 5 mayors here, and all 5 of the mayors have had the humility to be quite candid about some of the lessons to learn. And I'm about to tell you some lessons. I can promise you, if there were 5 prime ministers or presidents from our country here, they would say, no lessons to learn, we did nothing wrong. And that's one of the lessons over the last 30 years. I think all of us will, we're close to the people, and we can have the humility to recognize when things went badly and when things went well. And one of the things I think that all of Europe did badly, including my country, is the lack of preparation and planning and practice, because this virus didn't begin in Europe. It began in the Far East in December. So we had notice of this, yet the epicenter of this pandemic is Europe and New York. And that to me illustrates an arrogance that we have. We know best. We have the solutions. We aren't the Far East. We aren't China. And one of the lessons to learn, Carolina, is we've got to be far more humble about speaking to colleagues around the world. So one of the things I've done, not just speak to Rafał and the colleagues in this call. Yesterday I spoke to Mayor Park in Seoul. I spent a lot of time speaking to colleagues, not just in European cities, but around the world, to learn from them the mistakes they made, but the things they got right. And one of the things that I think we've got wrong, our national governments, and I think, Gergely had a lovely phrase about Budapest and Hungary. He said, the government failed the exam, the citizens passed the exam. And he's absolutely right. Governments failed to have confidence in the public when it came to messaging. And what Rafał was talking about, clarity of messaging. And in a crisis, you need clarity of messaging. And our government didn't realize the public are far more sophisticated and willing to do difficult things to keep ourselves safe. And that's a lesson we've got to learn going forward, to trust the public far, far more. The final thing I want to say is this, and it's an observation. I'm curious to hear from Budapest, Prague, Stockholm, and Warsaw. When things go well, even though we've done it, the government claims the credit. When things go badly, even though it's the government's fault, we get the blame. And we're seeing in London similar things to colleagues in Budapest and Warsaw, which is the government punishing cities by taking money away, not investing in cities, when in fact they should be rewarding our cities for what we've done. And I really think one of the lessons to learn also is we mayors have got to make sure our citizens stand up to the government about some of the centralization of power. And the mayor of Budapest was very honest about what his president is doing, using the opportunity provided by COVID-19 to grab more power. We've got to be vigilant towards that, and we rely upon our citizens to be vigilant for us as well.
Thank you very much. And at the same time, I would like to take a little bit further your comment about being humble. You are right that we all have new technological devices, new technologies to communicate, and at the same time, new problems. I lost my voice at the very beginning of our conversation. You lost the connection. Sometimes there are children running around in our Zoom and other video calls. So definitely it is a new world of new possibilities, but also of new problems. But for some reason, people have become more understanding, I believe, and I believe this is a very good thing. If I have, Sadiq, you at the floor, if you have the floor, can I just hold you a little bit more and ask you about Brexit? Does Brexit affect dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic in London these days?
Well, firstly, can I thank you for waiting 54 minutes before mentioning the B word?
You're very welcome. You're very welcome.
The short answer is, I'm afraid the bad news is my government has an ideological fixation with leaving the EU. So just to remind colleagues, we've left the EU. If we're going to apply for an extension, we have until the end of June. Now, the reality is the entire bandwidth of our government has been taken up by COVID-19, and not unreasonably, most of the EU has been focused on COVID-19. There have been no proper negotiations about a free trade deal. And my worry is, unless our government applies for an extension by the end of June, we must leave by the end of December, and that includes the possibility of leaving without a deal. But because our government is fixated by leaving the EU at the end of December, they are being stubborn and not willing to apply for an extension. And the bad news is our businesses, and all the mayors here like me are worried about our businesses in our cities, the small ones, the medium ones, the large ones. My concern in my country is we'll have a double whammy. We'll have a position where we're trying to come out of COVID-19 and recovery, and we're starting to make progress, and then bang, we'll leave the EU on the 31st of December without a deal, which will undo any progress made. So I'm really worried about the consequences on jobs and the economy, but I've been unsuccessful so far persuading my government to apply for an extension because they see it as a sign of weakness.
Thank you very much. And at the same time, we have 20 minutes left, and we'll make my very best not to mention the B word again. Now, I would like to ask you all a question about the potential of the European cities, because the new solidarity, the new European solidarity has been mentioned as a potential consequence of the pandemic. It was even compared with the Green New Deal, the European Green Deal. So there is this question about the potential of cities changing the face of Europe in the times of pandemic. At the same time, I would like you to address the question about civil liberties and liberal democracy as such. Because in many of your interventions, there was this recurring subject of the polarization between national government and the local governments. And also there was this recurring subject of illiberalism and liberal democracy being at two sides and very, very polarized politics, which is actually spoiling the attempts to fight the virus. So the question is about the potential of European cities, of building a better future with European solidarity, but also with less polarization. The question will now go first to Rafał Trzaskowski.
Well, I'll start with our civil liberties, because this is one of the most important things that obviously is now in our mind, that it is going to be very difficult to get the balance right. And even in democratic countries, and even in our countries, which sometimes have imperfections, and I'm not going to dwell on that too much, but we know that democracy is under attack, and in both Poland and Hungary for sure. I mean, it will be used to increase the power of the central government, the situation with COVID. And of course, it's a question of surveillance, it's a question of new technologies, it's a question of curtailing some of our freedoms, for example, freedom to manifest our views on the streets of our cities. And unfortunately, with some cynical politicians in government, such a danger has to be seen as pretty serious. So we are slowly out of the pandemic, which might come back. But what I'm really afraid of is that some of the measures that were taken in order to control the pandemic can be used in order to curtail our freedoms. And here we need to stick together and be really loud about that. When it comes to the crisis and when it comes to the potential of the cities, we all know that the potential of the cities is unbelievable, and that if we are to address the most important challenges of the world, we have to focus on how the cities develop. And that's why we cannot lose from sight some of the most important priorities that are ahead of us, such as fighting climate change, fighting for clean air in our cities, but also fighting inequalities. This is something that we should focus on. And every crisis is also a chance, an opportunity to address some of the most important issues that are ahead of us. I think that one of the most important things that I've learned from COVID was that I was able to really concentrate on what's really most important. And, we all did it at home. We all did it in our cities. Suddenly we had more time to spend with our kids, to listen to their concerns, to think about what really is important. Maybe not the next vacation, or maybe not, buying a new sofa, or spending time with friends, and discussing the future, but focusing on the kids, focusing on the loved ones, spending more time with them, having more patience, especially when it came to actually, taking some responsibility for educating them, which is always difficult in times of video transmissions. And I think that lessons from our homes can be actually taken, cherished, digested, and then used in our cities. That we should really focus on what's important, on some of the social changes that take place in our cities, on inequalities. I mean, can you imagine that in some of the most depraved parts of Warsaw, the school is the only place where kids have a possibility to have a warm lunch. And when schools were closed, some of those kids were left without the possibility to have a lunch. That kind of opens your eyes to what really is important. That we sometimes discuss hundreds of issues and so on and so forth, but at the end of the day, the quality of life, fighting injustice, fighting for our freedoms, and also focusing on the way in which the cities can develop in a way which can push governments to be much more courageous than they are on tackling some of the most important challenges that are before us, such as inequalities, such as climate change, such as fighting with injustice, such as fighting for standing next to the minorities, because minorities were most affected by what went in our cities, the seniors, the disabled, people who sometimes are relegated by our strong conservative governments to the margins of the society. And we need to stand next to those minorities, because that's our role. And I think that's the last thing I want to tell you, but this is the most important message. As you know, I'm running for the President of Poland, but the most important message is this, that what I've learned in self-government and from my illustrious friends such as yourselves is that the local government is there to facilitate the life of citizens who get by, and to stand firmly next to the minorities, all the people who are oppressed and put on the margins of the society. And this is the role of the central government as well. And I think that more and more in Europe, our central governments fail on that account.
Thank you very much, Rafał. And I would like now to turn to Gergely, because Rafał was talking at the very beginning about the danger that a pandemic or any other natural disaster, for that matter, may be used by central governments to consolidate their power. And I do believe that this is exactly what happened in Hungary. Viktor Orban has been allowed to rule by decree during the pandemic, because of the pandemic, or on the pretext of pandemic. And I would like you to also challenge the same question about the potential of cities, including Budapest, in empowering the citizens first, and then secondly also in building a better Europe in the future.
Valóban beszéltünk a
Indeed, we did talk about the challenges that affect democracy in terms of the pandemic. And indeed, liberal democracies in our region, where these liberal democracies and these institutions are not so rooted, these institutions need to be strengthened.
Nekem nagyon pozitív tapasztalatom volt.
To me, it was a very positive experience half a year ago. After the elections, that I share all my dilemmas, my problems with the citizens. I provide them information, I provide them data, and I try to include them. And this is the belief we can base ourselves on. and that we can indeed base ourselves and the future of our cities on this communication. So people who are on daily communication with the citizens, who indeed discuss matters with the citizens. The other very important experience is the old principle that I also represent, that is thinking globally, acting locally. That is the old principle. The pandemic, due to its global character, shows that we are indeed members of a huge family, and that global changes, global inequalities, global injustice, all this is present and are factors affecting our lives. But we also learned that we need to act, we need to take measures, we need to improve the life of our citizens, and as Rafał also said, we need to act and react to the pandemic, and we need to do that at a local level. So I believe that the governance of the future in terms of the EU, apart from the EU and apart from national governments, should be local governments of the cities. Because these global problems always appear, always crop up first in the cities, and it is in the cities that we have the necessary knowledge and political audacity to face these problems. We need to consider this problem as a huge exclamation mark. This pandemic is a huge exclamation mark. It is like a slap that came at the right time to wake us up, and that makes us feel our responsibility. Responsibility in terms of the decisions we take, and in terms of climate change, in terms of social justice. And indeed, every crisis that stops our everyday life questions our values. It's at the same time also an opportunity to make us think whether our values are indeed the values we believe they are. Robert De Niro, Madonna, and several famous artists made a declaration that we should not come back, return to normality, but we should find the points that are not just and not sustainable. And this political change, this green and social policy has as its most important representatives the cities. And I believe that for the European Union, it is very important to recognize the opportunity inherent in the alliance of the cities, and the cities should be the most important allies of in order to achieve the global aims of the European Union.
Thank you very much. And I would like to ask now Zdeněk Hřib, and the same question. In your remarks, and basically in remarks of all of you, you have been mentioning the growing role of cities. In fact, some theorists are actually claiming today that cities are going to take an ever more important role in the European Union and in Europe as a cultural entity. Do you also think so? And do you also think that there is a huge potential of cities for democracy and at the same time for European solidarity?
Well, definitely, because when we look back in the history, the role of the cities is very, very important. If you look to ancient Greece or even more into the history, you will see very, very powerful cities. And I believe that this is basically the times when the world become to understand why this is a good thing. Because to have this extra layer of democracy very close to the people, it's very, very big advantage if you compare this to, for example, some totalitarian regimes where the government is centrally based and top-down principle. So I have to say that also the fact that I forgot to mention, and that is that the European Union helped us a lot in the time of crisis. And for example, when I have mentioned that the central government sort of forgot on the fact that there are also small and medium enterprises in the Prague city, and which is quite amazing because Prague is responsible for 25% of the GDP of Czech Republic. The European Union came to rescue because we could have used the money that we got for innovations, and we could have used them for the rescue fund for the enterprises in Prague. So I believe that there is not just an emerging role of the cities, but this is also an emerging direct relationship between the European Union and the cities, because sometimes it is really good to actually circumvent the national layer. And I believe that the role of the cities will grow even more in the near future.
Thank you very much, Zdeněk. And now I would like to ask two other mayors of the same question again. So about the potential of the European cities in shaping the face of future, as for democracy, liberal democracy, and also as for solidarity in Europe. Perhaps we can start with Sadiq Khan.
Well, I think it's a really important issue, and arguably the most important issue raised so far. And I make this point to those watching in Poland. The mayor of Warsaw, over the last few years, has spent a lot of time building bridges with other cities around Europe and around the world. He's invested time making friendships, bringing in inward investment to Warsaw because of him building bridges. I know this because I've seen it for myself with London and Warsaw. Now, the reason why that's important is because you see it in the fruits of today. So let's be honest, today happened because Rafał picked up the phone and rang up 4 of his friends who happen to be mayors of 4 great cities. And that's the future I want to see, not just from cities across Europe, but our leaders of our countries to learn from what European cities are doing, leading the way, not simply as voices of progressive values, but if you like, as an antidote to some of the things the mayor of Budapest and the mayor of Warsaw have talked about with their respective governments, what Rafał and Gergely have talked about. Because my fear is this: when you speak to economists in the UK, around Europe and around the world, they are predicting the possibility of COVID leading to not just a recession, but depression not seen since the 1930s. And we know that depression and recessions of the 1930s led to nativist, populist movements and ultimately wars and really bad things happening. And I think mayors in European cities have a really big responsibility to be the antidote to the rise of nativist populist movements. So what was referred to by the mayor of Prague about not returning to business as usual, what Rafał's talked about a green new recovery, is so important, because we can't return to business as usual because the structural inequalities that existed then and the old ways of doing stuff aren't good enough for the 21st century. And I see cities in Europe being progressive leaders in the green economy. And I want to end with this really important quote. I've used it before, from a mayor in America. And he said, if the 19th century is known as a century of empires, the 20th century as a century of nation states, the 21st century should be one of cities and mayors. And it's really important we don't allow the leaders in our respective countries to learn the wrong lessons from this global pandemic.
this is a very beautiful vision, the 21st century of the cities, or as some say, the new Middle Ages, because this was the time when the cities in Europe played such an important role. And for the very last, I would like to ask Anna König Jerlmyr again the same question. In my ideal vision of Sweden, I have this picture of Sweden as the only country from our countries here in this discussion that doesn't have this tension between local governments and the national government. And I somehow think that you do not have the same polarization, but the question about preserving democracy, making the public sphere robust, and at the same time working on European solidarity prevails. It's still important, isn't it?
Yes, of course. And as a city and as a capital, we see the value of collaboration between other European cities because, as Sadiq said, it's the future belongs to the cities, and we can see that 75% of European citizens lives in cities. But also when it comes to the new Green Deal and environmental issues and sustainability, you can see that 70% of the Europe's CO2 emission is coming from the cities, but also the energy consumption, up to 80% comes from cities. So it's really important that we work together when it comes to sustainability and the green issues, and that is also important to our citizens, especially now after Corona. Clean air will be a crucial issue for our citizens. That's why we are transforming in a more sustainable way, and that's also why we collaborate between cities. And I'm the chair of EUROCITIES. It's a network amongst 140 cities, 35 countries, and also British cities are really active, and we're working together in 2 weeks. And in 2 weeks' time, we will have a meeting with Frans Timmermans, but also the EU Commission to just address how important the cities are working together, showing solidarity to each other, but also to these issues. And yesterday, we had a report released about what's the future for example, talents, because we can see that talent attraction, talent recruitment is really essential for our economy ahead. And they are now asking question, they choose city before company. And for them, for international student talents, the values of the city is crucial. And that's why we are talking about values in my city and how important it is to be trustworthy, to be free, to be open, sustainable, because we know that if we have these values, and I'm also in favor of what Rafał is doing in Warsaw with the LGBTQ rights and so on, that is crucial for future generation when they choose where to live. So if we want to have strong citizens and strong individuals, since we are liberal and we in favor of strong individuals rather than a strong state, then we need to attract more of these future talents. And then it's all about sustainability and the values that we know is really crucial for not only for us, but for Europe ahead.
Thank you very much, Anna. And I would like just to make two very brief remarks. The first remark, as I said at the very beginning, the social isolation and the measures, the quarantine measures, are simply very difficult for all of us. And that's why it's worth looking for bright sides of the COVID-19 pandemic. And listening to you, I have been thinking this is really a bright side. Because if yesterday we all thought that we are living in the times of a constant info and politainment, constant entertainment on the news and lack of gravity, then actually COVID-19 brought us in leadership, in European leadership, a very important gravity. So this is the first remark. The other remark is perhaps we shouldn't think about the future normality so much. The normality of today is already here, and this is what we have to deal with. And in this reality and this normality, cities, European cities, and cities in general will have a very important role. So a very warm thank you to everybody for taking part in this very, very interesting debate. And at the same time, thank you so much to everybody in the online virtual audience that have been listening to us. Thank you so much.